Before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. Today, I am speaking from the traditional lands of the Swepsum and Lekwungen ancestors and families, and it is with gratitude that I am able to live, work, and learn on these lands as a guest here. And we could all take a moment to personally acknowledge our land or your lands where you're joining us from today. This next session is on why local news matters, a panel discussion moderated by Robert Remington, who prior to joining Royal Roads as an associate faculty member, spent 4 decades as a reporter, columnist, editor, and correspondent at 3 major Canadian newspapers. He was awarded a Missioner Award and nominated for a National Newspaper Award. He's also a best-selling author and finalist for an Arthur Ellis Award for Best Nonfiction Crime Writing. Over to you, Robert.
Hey, thank you very much, Ali, former student of mine in course on communication ethics here at Royal Roads. Good to see you again. Today, the session is on why local news matters. And we have 4 senior executives from 4 different major news organizations here in British Columbia. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of them for a couple of minutes overview on our topic, sort of get us rolling. We'll have a 30-minute conversation on this topic, and then we'll open it up to some questions. And I'm going to start my day as I normally do with my local newspaper. I'm a news junkie. I constantly consume news, and I tend to be a newspaper person in the morning and a TV person in the afternoon. And the first thing I get up is I kind of go through a bunch of news sites, and I always turn to my local newspaper first, and that's the Victoria, the Times Colonist newspaper here in Victoria. So I'm going to introduce everybody as we go around the virtual table here. So I'm going to ask Dave Obee to start us off. Dave is the publisher and editor of the Times Colonist newspaper. He's been a journalist for half a century. You got 10 more years in this business than I do. He started as a sports reporter in Kamloops, and he worked for 5 other daily newspapers in British Columbia and Alberta before joining the Times Colonist in 1997. In 2012, Dave was awarded an honorary doctorate of laws by the University of Victoria for his work as a historian, genealogist, and journalist. And in 2017, he received the Bill Good Award for making a significant difference in journalism and the community at large. So welcome, Dave.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
Great. You and I talked a little bit by email on this topic, and I know that you have a lot of tremendous insight. So why don't you give us kind of a couple of minute overview on this topic of why local news matters, and maybe, you know, some other things. I know that you have a lot of thoughts on this topic, so I'll turn it over to you for a couple of minutes.
Certainly. To start off by talking about why local news matters, I can mention a couple of different people. One is John Tory in Toronto, the mayor of Toronto, who was forced to resign because of an investigation done by local media. They found out that he had lied and about his background, about things he was doing and so on, and was forced to resign as a result of that. Another one that happened, I think, in December is George Santos. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party in the States, neither of the parties actually did any kind of investigation on this guy. It was a local newspaper in New Jersey that actually did some research and said this guy's background isn't what he says it is. And as a result of that, the result was a massive sort of questioning of everything about his background. He's been revealed to be a serial liar, even to this day. Hasn't been forced to leave yet, but without the local media getting involved and saying, well, we can't support this guy because he's not telling the truth, where would Santos be today? Like he would be given more credibility than he certainly deserves. One of the problems that we're facing right now, I think, and it is half a century in this business for me. When I became a reporter, maybe not when I was 18 years old, but you know, in a short time, I was generally seen to be someone who could be trusted, someone who had information, someone, who knew what was going on in the community and a vital part of the community. And frankly, what's happened with sort of the loss of trust in the media, increasingly it seems that I'm just another evil person who is part of conspiracy, and I'm trying to pull wool over people's eyes. I'm someone to be pitied or reviled. And I think that doesn't apply just to me, it applies to almost everybody working in the business these days. And we're all, for the most part, doing the best we possibly can to get quality information out to readers and viewers and listeners. And the damage that's been done by people like Donald Trump and Alex Jones and the entire Fox network, it's enormous. They've smeared genuine journalism and replaced it with their own version of facts. And that damage has rippled into Canada. So that's what we're facing now, that the loss of trust in journalism, some of it self-inflicted, but most of it coming from outside.
Hey, great. Thanks a lot. Well, I'm going to come back to that. There's a lot of topics right there that we can explore. And right now I'm going to zoom over the Rocky Mountains and go to Calgary, or my former competitor and a friend of mine, Dawn Walton. She is the managing editor of CTV News Calgary. And prior to that, she was the Globe and Mail's national correspondent based in Calgary and Toronto. She has also written for CNN, Yahoo Finance Canada, Maclean's, the Toronto Star, the Canadian Press, Canadian Business Magazine, the Ottawa Citizen, the Kingston Whig Standard. And I was nominated once for a National Newspaper Award. She was a 5-time National Newspaper Award nominee and a 2-time winner. And she was twice nominated for the Mishner Award. She has a journalism degree from Carleton University and holds a law degree from Queen's University. Hello, Dawn.
Gosh, now I feel like, how am I going to follow Dave? How am I going to follow that? No, it's good to see everybody. It's funny when, like I, as you mentioned, I was the national correspondent for the Globe and Mail for a long time here. So it's interesting. I've been here at CTV for 9 years. And as national correspondents, you pay attention to local news, but you don't really cover local news, except local news actually has the biggest impact on people's lives day to day, whether it's finding out if there's a snow ban or what property taxes are going to be. But sometimes it's just those little stories that turn into big stories. And I think a big example of something that we had here was a terrible story of a senior citizen who was mauled to death by a bunch of dogs in a back alley. And that's a terrible one-off story and it's sad. But what we found out within 24 hours of reporting on this woman's death was that an ambulance didn't come for 30 minutes to pick her up. So then we started thinking, that's awful. Why would that happen? Then from that, it spun into a full half-hour and an hour-long documentary about what is going on with the EMS system. Why would an ambulance not show up for 30 minutes to pick up this lady who's been mauled so badly and maybe could have been saved? So we roll out our documentary finding numerous policy issues with EMS and the ambulance service. Our documentary airs the next day. The premier picks it up at her first press conference. This premier says, "Did you guys see the CTV documentary? Look at all the problems with the ambulance system. We need to fix this." And then started implementing the changes. But that started from a one-off small daily story. But it's the important function for democracy, society. And as it gets whittled away with people leaving the profession, not joining the profession, what Dave mentioned, the tax from outside, it just is we're at a tipping point, it feels like, in terms of the impact that we have and should have on a properly functioning democratic society.
Hey, thank you very much. Rob Germain. Rob Germain is the CEO, which stands for Chief Employee Owner at Czech Media Group in Victoria. Czech News is a proudly locally owned station here, employee-owned station in Victoria. Rob has been in broadcasting for 30 plus years. He was a producer at BC TV, now Global BC for 6 years. He was assignment editor at Czech in 1995 and appointed news director in 2002, a position he held for 17 years. And this is interesting. It was 2009, Rob, I think that you were instrumental in helping save Czech, bringing together employees, the union, community-minded investors, in a successful bid to take over the station. And Czech is now the only employee-owned TV station in North America, which is interesting in an area of conglomerate ownership or news organizations that are run by hedge funds and everything else. It's quite an achievement. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Radio Television News Directors Association in 2019. He was co-recipient of the Webster Foundation Bill Good Award in 2022, and since becoming its CEO, Czech has been recognized as Greater Victoria Business of the Year in 2021, and Rob also serves as president of the British Columbia Association of Broadcasters. So Rob, welcome. We're waiting to hear from you. One of the things that has come up in the previous two is this issue of trust. The Washington Post recently wrote that local news is the oxygen of democracy, the most trusted source for the most essential information. Is that necessarily true? I'm kind of preempting your overview here, but it seems to be a theme that seems to be emerging. But I'll turn it over to you for an overview.
Yeah, I remember a CRTC survey, well, about 5 or 8 years ago, somewhere in there, that asked people, Canadians, if they trusted local news, and 80% said they strongly trusted local news. It was more than any other, genre. But I can tell you, I think that's quickly eroding. I think there is, through misinformation and such. I every Wednesday may hear car horns coming pretty soon, because outside my window here, we have protesters every Wednesday that are protesting. They're anti-vaxxers that and supporting the convoy kind of thing. And so we get lots of horn honking and because they show up protesting, and they're protesting stories that they think we should be covering, I think, but when I try to go out there and talk to them and try to get an understanding of where they're coming from and there's really nothing that we can, that we can factualize, that we can pinpoint. I mean, local news, at least broadcasters for sure, newspapers, we're professional journalists that follow codes of ethics. And I think people don't understand that. I think people take it for granted. We saw when we were almost closed in 2009, and by the way, at the time, Czech and Global, where Bhupinder works, and the Times Colonist, where Dave works, were all owned by the same conglomerate. And that conglomerate was heavy in debt and going into receivership, and Czech almost closed, and there was no buyer for it. An institution that has been broadcasting on Vancouver Island since 1956. Almost closed for good at that time. And at the very last minute, employees and people that in the community that felt strongly that they wanted to see this institution keep going, and our union all came together to save Czech. But if it wasn't for that, it would be gone. And it's amazing how quickly that can happen. And I think people take for granted local news. They just assume, I don't have to pay for a subscription. It's going to be, I get the news on my social media feeds. They don't understand where those news stories and their social media feeds come from, or that they're paying, professional journalists to fact check and to generate those stories. And one day it could all just disappear. And I think that we may not really appreciate why local news matters until it's gone.
Hey, thank you very much. We'll come back to that. You mentioned codes of ethics, and this is a communication ethics conference. So when I talk about communication ethics in my class, we deal a lot with codes of ethics. Right now, I'm going to go to Vancouver. Bhupinder Hundal. Am I pronouncing your name right? The last name, Hundal?
Hundal is fine.
Okay, great. Bhupinder is news director and station manager at Global BC. He oversees one of the largest newsrooms in Canada. Prior to joining Global, he was senior producer at CBC News Vancouver, and prior to that, he founded Cross Connect Media, creating media solutions designed to enhance the profile of mainstream news organizations in ethnic communities. If you follow hockey at all, you may know or remember Bhupinder as one of the voices of Hockey Night in Canada Punjabi edition. I think he was one of the originals on that. And behind the scenes, he developed the strategy to propel that broadcast to international acclaim. He also had a successful tenure as a news manager of Omni Television in BC, overseeing the station's Mandarin, Cantonese, and Punjabi newscasts. So it's so nice to meet you, Bhupinder, and welcome. I was such a big fan of Hockey Night in Canada Punjabi edition, even though I didn't really understand a lot. The excitement that is generated, that's one thing that live TV does, and the excitement that your team brought to hockey, I just went, this is great. I'm going to watch it, even though I don't understand it. So over to you for a couple of minutes overview on our topic.
Well, just on that, we kind of tapped into two core feelings that people have when they watch, which is they want to feel excited and they want to have a good time. And we, over the course of those broadcasts, those are all the things that we would concentrate on. How can we make sure that people were excited and had a good time, and we brought a lot of energy? So, some of those things are universal, and regardless of what language, you can always tap into people's hearts and minds and feelings. So that's what we always tried to do. Thank you for the introduction. Great points raised by everyone here, and I think this is a challenging time for journalists and journalism. But why local news matters? It matters because without local journalists doing the groundwork and talking to people in the community, raising issues in your community that you or your neighbors are having, not holding power to account, like if you don't have people doing that work, it does erode your sense of community. It does erode a sense of accountability. And, on top of the eroding trust that we're dealing with as journalists, one of the things that I would say that that I'm seeing in society in general that is worrisome is that we all operate in our own little bubbles. And we find a pocket here, and it's like-minded people, and that's all we're consuming. And there's another pocket over here, and then there's another pocket over here, and the pockets aren't talking to each other. And what's happening with that is that we're losing perspective. We're only listening to people who we agree with. We're not considering perspectives that we perhaps may not agree with, or we are not listening to perspectives or different viewpoints that people might have of something that we hold near and dear as a perspective, and consider the possibility that there might be something else that I should consider or bring into my brain as part of my thought process. That's what we're starting to see. A lot of people in their own little bubbles and unwilling or not wanting to explore other perspectives and other bubbles. And I think, one of the things that us journalists have to do is we have to try to navigate that realm. We have to look at what is being said and what perspectives that different people have, and ensure that we're reflecting that as much as possible in what it is that we do and the various issues that we cover. And what's happening in journalism is that you're getting attacked all the time. So if you present something here, you'll have a group of people in a particular bubble who will start saying you're not doing this and you're not doing that, and then you very next few minutes later doing something else, and you got another bubble who is like all enraged and on the attack, and you're getting these various pockets that are, again, isolated, finding commonality within their small group and getting hardened as a result. And that's creating a very divisive, toxic, I would say, environment that I think affects us all. And why journalism is important is because, we are the ones that have to sit there and understand what's going on and be able to navigate situations and circumstances and determine the facts that may exist with a particular story, and make sure that we're doing the due diligence and making sure that we're putting out information that is accurate and correct, but also supported with concrete evidence. Like, those are the things that we have to do more so, and it's more so important now that we do that, as many groups are more interested in being critical of the work that we do, which is fine. We should be open to criticism. We are like any other group. If we're going to have the responsibility of holding power to account, we are also a powerful entity, and we should also be held to account. But at the same time, you are seeing this toxic nature kind of take over. And that's not something that, not just journalists have to contend with. I think we all have a role to play in figuring out how we're going to combat this issue that is plaguing our society right now. And it is a serious concern.
It's we could go on for a long time, and I want to give everybody another chance, but Bhupinder, you raised the issue of this commonality of people in bubbles, and prior to the fragmentation of information, most everybody was on the same page in a community. Everybody was reading the local newspaper and watching their local television station, and it gave a sense of common purpose to the community that you were in, and that's fragmented a lot, as you mentioned. But interesting, you raised about different perspectives. Leonard Downey, he was a former executive editor of the Washington Post. He did a guest essay recently, and he made the case that newsrooms should set aside journalistic objectivity, because there's a new generation of journalists, and probably even viewers or readers, that believe that pursuing objectivity, this is his quote, can lead to false balance of misleading both sidesism. So I have this perspective, so I have to give this person their perspective as well, even though if you vehemently disagree with it, or it's just a very interesting issue to discuss. And Dave, I know that we had communicated earlier, and you talked about this lack of trust, and I was wondering about, should newspapers be so blatantly objective, or try to be objective, or should they be present a point of view?
I think they newspapers have a spot for a point of view. It's the opinion page, comment page, whatever it's called. I think in general terms, we have to do our best to be objective in what we cover. I've known too many people coming into the business who basically wanted to have the big megaphone that we offered to present their point of view on life and their agenda, and having to deal with that. If people say, abandon objectivity, what does that really mean? Does that mean that we rely on one reporter's personal agenda, or what? Now, beyond that, is there an issue when it comes to something like vaccines? Are vaccines good or bad? Do we have objectivity when it comes to that? When it comes to a pandemic and health advice, do we strive to get the second side on that? I would say no. But that makes me, people who honk outside of Rob's office all the time, they hate me just as much. Just for the record, I get hate mail. They're not honking. They send me emails. There are some times when there's no debate. There should not be a debate anymore. This is, the science is settled, and the people who are raising objections to the science are the people who have no training or experience whatsoever in that field. Do we give them equal time? I say no. But the whole question of objectivity, accuracy, and so on, there have been conspiracy theories for as long as I've been a consumer of news. Honestly, after Kennedy was shot, there were conspiracy theories right away about Oswald didn't do it, that kind of thing. But things really got out of hand after Sandy Hook. The massacre at Sandy Hook 10 years ago, and Alex Jones found a way to make millions and millions of dollars by preaching to people lies that the thing never happened. And as a result, he became fabulously wealthy, and he hurt a lot of people. But he sort of fed this engine And if people, see a conspiracy there, they see a conspiracy somewhere else. They see, I've had someone tell me that COVID doesn't even exist. It was just made up. The vaccine isn't right, and so on and so on. If they believe one conspiracy theory, you can assume they'll believe a whole lot more. And trying to reach those people and try to get them to pay attention to local news. Like talking, with Bhupinder, like, Keith Baldry is incredibly well known across the province for his reporting, and he does his darndest to be objective about it. But he gets hate mail all the time because he's simply trying to do what is right for the community, and it's pretty scary. Even most recently, our coverage of those silly balloons has been seen as our effort to direct people's attention away from what's really happening, what the government's really doing. And again, once you see that kind of thing, it goes on forever. And the local media has a role in trying to bridge the gap. Like as Bhupinder said, there are all these silos, and people are in these silos. They're in these echo chambers. They're in their bubbles. They can listen to what they want to listen to. I can believe the most outrageous things in the world, and I'll have people online who will agree with me and tell me I'm right. And I'm doing Google searches based on my outrageous beliefs, and Google, after a while, recognizes, because I'm using the same computer and so on to do my searches, Google will recognize that, hey, this is the kind of stuff that Dave believes in, and it'll feed me more of that, even when I do a neutral search. So again, it'll feed me information that makes me think that I'm right. And again, the Bhupinder's reference to the attacks we're facing. I know several people who have left the business because they can't handle it anymore. And there's financially, I don't have to work anymore. I'm only doing this because I'm absolutely dedicated to what I'm doing. I want to see local news thrive in Victoria, and I'm doing everything I can to do that. But there are days, we had an editorial on the weekend where basically saying that the government, in stopping the convoy last year, you should not have used the Emergencies Act, and the justice who said it was okay was probably not correct. And the abuse I've gotten over the past 3 days over that one, how would you like it if they started defecating on your lawn and talking about, that's not the point. The point is the wrong thing was used, the wrong tool was used. So anyway, two thoughts.
Don, you've worked in both newspapers and broadcast. Is there any more vitriol directed towards newspapers than television? Or I'm just wondering what your perspective is. Do you get hate mail?
The TV folks are much more recognizable by virtue of being on TV. So, yeah. I mean, it's no secret decals have been removed from the cars. A few people still have the CTV logo, but otherwise they're just white vehicles. So they're less recognizable because we've had incidents at a lot of the anti-vax type events. We don't send reporters, VJs by themselves to those types of events. They're at the Coops protest in a pair. We've sometimes had security detail with them at events, especially at the height of the pandemic. It's ugly. The vitriol from the right is terrible. However, the vitriol from the left can also be bad. And to Dave's point on, and what you were raising about objectivity or a false balance issue, we had an interesting story a couple of weeks ago. There's an outdoor like ice festival here, and a group was having a drag show outside downtown. And there's a group of protesters that don't want these drag shows in public places because they're worried about children seeing these events. So this particular drag show was shut down due to safety concerns and canceled from this outdoor festival that nobody is forced to go to. Like, if you want to go to the festival and bring your children to the festival, go to the festival. In any event, we did the story talking to the organizers, talking to the mayor, talking to city councilors, talking to the downtown association, and we talked to the organizer of the protest who doesn't want this event to happen. So that's covering the waterfront on this story. My goodness, the attacks we received from, I guess, progressives how dare we include the protester in the story? Well, this
Right.
was a group that shut down the event. And they weren't spewing hate in our interview. They were just explaining they don't think it's right. They think this shouldn't be held in a public space. I mean, we, I guess, muted a little bit of their spewing of some stuff that we wouldn't put on TV. But my goodness, then we're like, should we have included that person? And our view is, well, we're not advocates, we're journalists. And our journalistic mission is very different than an advocacy mission.
Right. Bhupinder, you have your hand up. I'm going to go over to you. Is there something you wanted to raise that came up?
Yeah, no, I know there's a couple of comments in the chat around objectivity and as you mentioned, like, you know, is there two sides to every story? And I think, you know, objectivity is a funny thing, but you know, it means different things to different people. What I do think that, you know, us journalists need to do a better job of, and, you know, something that we actively need to continue to work on is how do we consider more perspectives other than our own, right? So, you know, simple case in point, we're deciding on doing a story. Sometimes there aren't two sides to a story. Sometimes there's much more nuance involved that we actually need to consider as part of the story. Sometimes there are perspectives and that we're not considering because we're not at that dinner table conversation. And I talk about this, you know, within, you know, global news, for example, right? Like my dinner table conversation with my family is going to be much different than your dinner table conversation with your family. The issues that you may be talking about that are front and center are going to be different than mine. But that doesn't mean yours are more important than mine and mine are more important than yours. But what we do need to do is we need to kind of understand what are these conversations at different dinner tables and why are those issues important to them? And consider them as part of our process when we're figuring out, okay, why do we need to cover certain stories? Or what are the perspectives that we need to consider on particular stories? And I think, you know, thinking about those things and actively trying to incorporate that in our work is one of the things that we as journalists have to do. Now, obviously, the biggest challenge that we're facing right now is that you know, because of the recent toxicity and people leaving the business, the amount of, you know, I read stuff every day, like, you know, racist stuff, sexist stuff, just flat out attacks. Like, you know, there's only so much that people can endure of that kind of stuff. And as a result, you're seeing people leave and not want any part of that for their own mental health. But what that is going to result in the long run is more of an erosion. You have people who probably don't have as much experience, or people who don't have as much knowledge in particular subject areas, and you know, that's added pressure on them to be able to now consider so much more when they have to do their work. And it is a very daunting task for any, especially, you know, young journalists who are coming up, and anyone between the ages of like 22 and 35, they're going to have a significant challenge in being able to figure out how they're going to effectively do their job, you know, moving forward in the climate that we're in right now. So, you know, you've got a lot of these compounding issues, but I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, I say to my group is, again, we all have our own bubble, and our pursuit should be, how do we get a perspective outside of our own bubble? Because there is a certain element of privilege that comes with me in my role, in my position, or somebody else's role in the newsroom, or so on and so forth. But you know, the biggest thing that we gotta figure out is how do we consider those perspectives, whether we agree with them, and including the ones we necessarily don't agree with, because those are important. And our job is to give a well-rounded view of a particular subject matter so that people are better informed of the perspectives that they might hold near and dear and that they agree with, but also have an element that they hear from perspectives that they don't necessarily agree with. And that's a real tough balance to to kind of get, right? And you see this mostly in politics, right? Like on any given day, it's like we hate liberals, or we hate NDPers, or we hate conservatives, or we like them, or just depends on the day of the week sometimes. And it's like, we really don't care that much. At the end of the day, from a journalist perspective, it's like, you're giving us news all the time that we're going to cover all the time. We don't get into that as much as people think. So no, it's not true. I'm not waiting for a call from the PMO's office about what story I'm going to do today. Yeah, that doesn't happen, folks. So just
right.
let it go.
Rob, you or Dave has one. I just want to quickly go over to Rob. Rob, you had raised the issue of codes of ethics, and it's something that professional journalists observe. There's some discussion in the chat about citizen journalists. There was a move at one time in Quebec to actually license journalists, and there was big pushback and said, no, that shouldn't happen. In perspective, there are, and I've seen it, there are a lot of people in the blogosphere who have no concept of legal issues, who have, they're overstepping the bounds of what's imposed by the courts and everything else. And there is sort of no codes of ethics for the internet for many people, citizen journalists, perhaps. There are some really, really good bloggers out there. I'm not demeaning anybody, but there are those who just do not have that perspective, that professional training. How do you, could you talk a little bit about, codes of ethics and how you observe them and what you take into account?
Well, I mean, as a broadcaster, we're regulated, and we have to be owned by Canadians. We have to follow codes of conduct, standards, for broadcasting. We belong, it's voluntary, but we belong to the Broadcast Standards Council. So if somebody has a complaint about something we've shown on TV or something we've reported, they can go to a tribunal with their complaint. If we've reported something that was incorrect, false, and we aren't willing to correct it, they can take it to the Broadcast Standards Council. That Broadcast Standards Council can have a panel of independent professionals rule on whether or not there was an infraction, and we have to correct the error and let people know that we had made an error, and we have to, there's a certain process in place. So I think those kinds of things are really important, frankly, as opposed to a journalist who, a blogger or a Breitbart that looks like a news organization, but they're really, funded by dark money that has a political agenda, where you can trust on broadcasters to be following codes of ethics because we're accountable. And press councils used to exist. I don't know if they still do in the newspaper industries for the same purpose, where you could go to a tribunal and get hearing. I think that's something that we need to band together as professional journalists and create and regulate ourselves and give and be accountable. And that way we're going to be able to restore trust with the community.
Ali, how are we doing on time? Do we want to take a few questions that are in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 1:40 right now. And I just want to thank everybody for all of their wonderful comments and questions in the chat. We won't have time for them all, but hopefully some of them have been addressed by our speakers midway through. So to begin with, Venus asked, have you found trust in journalism and news has been further eroded since the beginning of the pandemic, or has trust been eroding for a while now? Has the pandemic created an opportunity to create divisions in journalism, or just bring those divisions to the surface?
Who wants to take that one? Anyone? Dave?
I think it's been eroding for quite some time. I think the pandemic for a while eased that. Like it actually was better for a while at the start of the pandemic because we were all in this together and so on. That was the theory, and everyone was banding together and honking or banging our pots at 7 p.m. and stuff like that. But I think as the pandemic went on, I started to see about a year in, I started to see things change, and all of the haters came out. And I think they are leading the charge, to destroy the base of trust. Basically, they don't like what we're saying because they don't agree with things that are happening, and therefore we shouldn't be saying stuff they don't like. If we're presenting something that's not their personal opinion, they think it's wrong. So
Yeah, and I would say, if this is just my perspective, you should be consuming news in a manner that, with the understanding that everything you're going to see, you will not agree with it all, and you may agree with some of it, and you may disagree with some of it. Like, we have to keep that lens in mind. Like, so, when I read news, I like to read different perspectives, and I like to read different outlets so I can have a better understanding of what's going on around me and have a better overall picture. But, we do have, tendencies here that, and especially in the United States, where, one person's like, the only thing I watch is this thing right here. That's the only thing I read. That's the only thing I watch. That's the only thing I listen to. And that's my go-to source. Well, what ends up happening is that is now your bubble, and that's the only thing I exist. And anything outside of that is all of a sudden not part of your consideration or your thought process. So I think, from my perspective, I think it's probably a healthy thing. When in a newscast, there are things that you're going to feel as though you align with, and that align with you, and perspectives that align with you, but there's also things that you may not necessarily agree with, but you're at least getting a well-rounded picture of what the view is on this particular, so you can be better informed as you go out in public, and hey, what's going on with this issue? What are the considerations here? And that can hopefully have a better informed public, which is what we all want, right? The more knowledgeable we are, the better informed we all are, the better our society will be, the better our community will be. So I think it's really important that we continue to engage in that. But like I said, like, how do we get people to look at things outside of their own perspective? That checks us on our own biases, and make sure that we're not having those biases override stories too, because I know, just looking at the chat, that is one of those things. Like, there is an unconscious bias that we all have, that we come in with. So what kind of checks and balances, and how do we check those biases when we're doing something? I think it's important that we kind of look actively outside our bubble to do that.
I think it's, if I could, I think it speaks volumes about where media consumption has gone, that it's now part of the Alberta curriculum, that in grade 4, kids are taught how to spot fake news and how to find real, honest websites for media news content. And that wasn't the case, 10 years ago? And now that starts in grade 4 here. I don't know about in BC.
I don't know. Allie, what else do we have?
Yeah, so Annie was wondering if you could talk about journalism in relation to government sectors.
I'm not sure what the meaning of that is. Anyone want to take that on in relation to government sectors?
In that nobody conducts an interview anymore, and all things must go through an email, and then answers come back via email, and then you respond with another email, and nobody ever phones you or will go on camera ever.
It was really interesting. Yeah, well, there's that. I mean, when I remember I used to cover a lot of issues in Banff National Park, and it used to be that you could walk into the chief park warden's office and you could interview somebody, and then all of a sudden it became, no, you have to give us the question, and then to the communications director, and then that has to go to Ottawa, and then they'll form a response, and maybe 3 days later they'll get back to you. Right? So it's like, so that's, I think, why you see so many news stories that, we reached out to the department of such and such of widgets and wheels, and they haven't gotten back to us at deadline. So I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but there's a lot of vetting that goes on to get a particular message out rather than just going directly to. At one time, you could, police. We used to be able to read police reports when I was a young reporter. You go in and read them. You can't do that anymore. Everything is filtered.
Another good example is, from the pandemic, what happened then was the press conferences. They weren't even press conferences; they were briefings. The reporters there were handpicked by the government, and couldn't, because it's all being done by a Zoom. If they didn't allow you to speak, you didn't ask a question. And beyond that, several of the most capable reporters in the country asked questions that were not appreciated. And as a result, they were never asked again to ask a question. The government control over that kind of thing. They don't control the media, but they certainly can control that level of interaction. And I think that is what it's kind of deceptive in a way, because it's made the politicians think they can say whatever they want. They can control us completely, which they can't.
We find we're right. Oh, I'm sorry. We find, I'll be quick, writing into stories, said in a statement, did not respond to our request for an interview, because I remember getting a phone call from a viewer saying we're anti the United Conservative government because they're never in our stories. And then kind of the light bulb went on. We have to actually spell out all the ways we attempted to reach the government, and the government did not respond or only provided this very brief response. So some people think that this much is the opposition and this much is the government, is us not giving the government a fair shake. Well, the government isn't allowing us any information to give them that fair shake.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a push and pull between journalists and governments. They want to control the message, obviously. But at the same time, we have to continue to keep pushing. I think what you are seeing more often than not, especially in the last few years, is a proliferation of statements. I'll give you a statement, that's all good. And it's like, no, because that takes away the ability for us to actually ask a follow-up question, or ask a detailed question, or, hey, you've said this, here's the actual counterpoint to it. And those opportunities are getting far less and less. And I know somebody has mentioned Neetu Garcha's name here, who has done a fantastic job in holding politicians to account. But it's equal across the board when she's doing it. So, when we were working on getting leaders of all the major political parties, including Justin Trudeau and Aaron O'Toole and Jagmeet Singh, all of those interviews were hard-hitting interviews, and we were not going to pull any punches on any of them. But it's getting harder and harder to do that, because what happens is, when you are from a government perspective, when you're putting your person in that position, more likely than not, it's not going to be positive for them. And as a result, that's why they're holding back so much more. So there is this definite tussle between, I would say, not one party is better than the other. Like when they're in opposition, they all like to talk, but once they get into government, then they all kind of zip up. It's the same thing regardless of political party. They all do the same thing, and they all go to the same playbook. But there is a healthy tension there, and there should be. Our job is to ask accountability questions, and their job is to make themselves available, because ultimately they are elected by the public. And these press conferences, yes, definitely do make it harder. But I'm glad now, out of the pandemic, we're actually able to get back in person to do some of these things and ask direct questions.
I see in the chat, Cindy McDougall raises, and I assume, Cindy, that you were in communications for the government. She says, I want to gently point out, I had many reporters ask me just for a statement rather than push for the interview, sometimes even when I offered to chase the minister for them. So let me ask, do we sometimes go for the low-hanging fruit How much time and effort and energy and resources are there available to actually really dig? Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, I would say it's getting harder and harder, for sure. I would be disappointed if I had a journalist in my shop who took the statement as opposed to the interview. Um, and I think that would be the case for any newsroom. But no, like it makes a world of difference when you have a in-person interview than just a statement, and the amount of information and the transparency. Like this is the most important thing, right? Like we talk about transparency and building trust, whether it be for politicians or for journalists. Like that's a real important element when it comes to building trust. Reading something like a generic statement is not actually building trust with anyone. So I think that in-person communication is critical.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Justine did have a nice sort of wrap-up question. As communications professionals at this conference, do you have any final thoughts, any messages to pass on for us in this current environment? What would you like to see so we can work better together?
I'm sorry, was that directed to somebody in particular or anyone?
No, just to the panelists, just sort of, yeah, any advice and thoughts? That would be a nice final question.
Well, I think, as a communications person working as a public servant, let's remember that you're a public servant. You're working for the public, not for the government, not for the politicians. And we are too. We're advocates for the public. That's who we're speaking on behalf. We're not here to make Times Colonist or Czech or Global. The point of it all. It's getting information for the public, and we're acting on their behalf. And please see that when we approach you to get, as a communications person, to get information from whatever organization you work for. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for information on behalf of the public, and you're working for the public. So we should be able to work together.
Great. I think are we out of time?
About 3 minutes remaining.
Well, about 3 minutes. Well, let's see.
Can I mention
Dave?
one other thing?
Yeah,
One other thing that is really coming up now more and more often. I've been giving talks to community groups about the media for decades. And way back in the day, I would start off by asking, where do you get your news? I just see what hands went up about the newspapers, radio, TV, whatever. Increasingly over the past few years, I have people saying, I don't pay any attention to news. And that, like the basic news fatigue is a massive issue, especially in local communities. How do you decide who to vote for when election day comes around and you paid no attention to what council has done or the MLA has done or whatever? And a few years ago, we had someone I knew, a woman probably 70-ish, went missing. And it was all over radio, TV, and the newspaper on our front page. I went up and down probably every road on the Saanich Peninsula to see if I could find her car. I stopped whenever I saw someone working in their yard, and I asked, "Have you seen, the woman who's missing?" And I think every single time I asked someone, they said, "What woman?" It had been all over all the local media. We had not missed it. Everyone was on this story, and so many people were not even dimly aware. They could have seen something happening in their backyard and not even been aware that it mattered. And that to me is absolutely, hurting the fabric of the community when people aren't getting that sort of common bond between them the way they used to. So news fatigue is one of the major concerns we face as well.
Yeah, I see that as well. In my class, I asked students to monitor news, and a lot of them just don't want to engage. Nahed Nenshi this morning referred to it as he spends a lot of time doom scrolling, going because the news is so bad. Anyway, I want to thank everybody. I think we're probably out of time. It's been, we could go on for a lot longer than we have. I maybe wanted to leave you with this, and Nahed Nenshi had raised this earlier this morning. Somebody asked him, when are you going to leave? I can't remember. When are you going to go to politics on a larger scale? And he said, I'm not going to politics on a larger scale because cities are where it's at. And he said, I wouldn't consider taking a less important job. And maybe that has something to do with local news, because essentially all news is local news, whether it be Ukraine, it's always local news somewhere. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for attending. And Ali, do you have anything to close, or are we done?
Yeah, just again, thank you to everyone for all the panelists and all of our attendees for this fabulous and engaging session. I loved seeing all of the comments in the chat, and we've noted them all down. This session and all of the sessions in the conference have been recorded and will be sent out to all of our registered participants to review after. In about 5 minutes, our final session of the day will begin: ethical questioning and socially engaged theater, processes and procedures.